Why was Iran never colonized? While powerful empires conquered much of the Middle East, in this documentary, we'll uncover the real history behind why Iran was never colonized. The answer isn't just about military power. It's about Iran's geography, the great game between Britain and Russia, and the strategic decisions that changed world history. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Iran became one of the few nations that escaped full colonial rule, and why that history still shapes global geopolitics today.
Okay, let's dive into this explainer and unpack a truly fascinating historical mystery. Picture the 19th and early 20th centuries. The world map is being aggressively redrawn by European imperial powers, right? But somehow, one major nation in the Middle East managed to keep its borders completely intact and its own flag flying. That nation was Iran, or as it was widely known back then, Persia. Now, what's really interesting here is the sheer scale of the question this raises. Just think about it. Almost every single surrounding region was completely conquered by a foreign power. You had the Ottoman Empire to the west, which was slowly declining, and over to the east, India was locked firmly under British rule. This massive era of colonization literally swept across the globe, yet Iran emerged as this glaring exception. It never formally fell under direct colonial rule. So, how on earth did they pull this off? To solve this mystery, we're going to break the historical evidence down into 5 structured pillars. We'll look at a geographic fortress, the Great Game, the buffer state strategy, black gold, and finally, the semi-colonial reality.
All right, let's jump right into part 1, a geographic fortress.
Before we even touch on the politics, we absolutely have to talk about geography. Because Iran's extreme terrain, everything from jagged mountain peaks to totally uncrossable salt wastes, made logistics a literal nightmare for any modern invading army. Just think about these natural defenses. You've got the Zagros Mountains forming this massive 1,600-kilometer wall with peaks hitting 4,000 meters. That utterly stops large-scale armored movements from the west. Up north, the super steep Alborz Range completely shields the capital, Tehran, from the Caspian Sea. Right in the center, you have forbidding salt deserts, the Dasht-e-Kavir and Dasht-e-Lut, that act like giant black holes just swallowing up supply lines. And down in the southwest, the marshlands of Khuzestan create this massive boggy buffer against heavy tanks.
Now, when you combine that absolutely brutal terrain with a staggering 1.6 million square kilometers, to put that into perspective, that is roughly 3 times the size of France, you quickly realize an occupation would require just an impossible amount of troops. The nation's sheer scale, sitting up on this elevated plateau where invaders literally have to fight uphill through narrow passes, it means that trying to occupy Iran would completely drain the resources of any empire foolish enough to try and hold it.
But geography is really only half the story here. Let's shift gears to part 2, the Great Game. So the crucial point to understand is that Iran was caught directly on the geopolitical chessboard between 2 expanding superpowers who were frankly locked in mutual paranoia. On one side, you have the Russian Empire relentlessly pushing down from the north, totally desperate to expand toward the Indian Ocean for warm water ports. And on the flip side, you've got the British Empire. They were obsessed, and I mean obsessed, with protecting India, the absolute crown jewel of their empire, from any potential Russian advance. And Iran? Well, Iran just happened to be the massive geographic buffer sitting right smack in the middle of them. Now, although they were never fully conquered, Iran still suffered incredibly painful, gradual territorial losses over the years. The Qajar dynasty, ruling Iran at the time, simply couldn't match European industrialized militaries. It was a harsh reality. In 1813 and 1828, brutal wars with Russia stripped Iran of the Caucasus and Armenia. Then, jump to 1857, and a conflict with Britain saw Iran lose control of highly valuable eastern territories like Herat. So while they weren't colonized outright, the empire was quite literally being chipped away, piece by piece, as a result of these imperial clashes. This constant, heavy external pressure brings us nicely to our third theme, the buffer state strategy. This diplomatic balancing act actually culminated in Britain and Russia essentially carving up Iran into economic spheres of influence. Actually, scratch that. They didn't just carve it up informally, they formalized it in the deeply humiliating 1907 Anglo-Russian Convention. Neither superpower wanted the other to get total control, so they made a deal. Russia took the north, Britain took the south, and they left a neutral zone right in the center just to prevent an all-out war between themselves. Honestly, this was the absolute closest Iran ever came to formal colonization.
Since the Iranian rulers totally knew they couldn't defeat either of these empires militarily, they tactically played the British and Russians against each other. It was a completely precarious tightrope walk. The Qajar Shahs figured out that if Britain invaded, Russia would retaliate, and vice versa. So
They deliberately played both sides, granting concessions left and right just to exist in that stalemate. They secured their survival on the map for sure, but at the cost of immense, overwhelming foreign influence. Okay, let's dive into part 4 and see what happened when a highly coveted, world-changing resource complicated this delicate balance. Black gold. Just as this stalemate seemed sort of stable, massive oil reserves were discovered in the early 20th century. Talk about a game changer. This discovery dramatically ramped up foreign intervention. Overwhelming British economic pressure practically forced the Iranian government into signing away their oil rights. This led directly to the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which you probably know today as BP, assuming near total control of the oil industry. Britain basically secured a monopoly over this vital new resource, locking the nation into deeply unequal contracts that completely drained their wealth, all without ever officially raising a British flag over the government.
This builds perfectly into our final, and honestly most profound section, the semi-colonial reality.
This part completely flips everything we've talked about so far right on its head. Did keeping their borders actually mean they kept their freedom? Well, consider the capitulations. These were legal treaties forcing Iran to surrender domestic judicial power over foreigners. It effectively granted them total immunity from Iranian law. Just imagine that for a second. Foreigners walking around your country, completely immune to your laws. If a British or Russian citizen committed a crime in Iran, they couldn't even be tried in an Iranian court. For the Iranian people, these legal surrenders were deeply despised. They represented the ultimate loss of self-determination, even if there wasn't a foreign flag flying over the capital. All this foreign dominance triggered a massive intellectual crisis. Thinkers started diagnosing the nation with this epistemic dependency and internal decay stemming from such uneven modernization. The prominent thinker, Jalal Ali Ahmed, actually coined a really powerful term for it, kharabzadagi, which translates roughly to Westoxification or Weststruckness. He diagnosed it as a national malady, an obsession with blindly consuming Western technology, goods, and machines without ever actually mastering the science or rationale behind them. They were becoming dependent consumers rather than independent producers. And you can really see the cultural anxiety of the era in this concept of the Fakoli. The Fakoli was a heavily ridiculed Europhile dandy. This was a cultural caricature of someone who completely mimicked Western fashion and spoke this fractured mix of Persian and French just to seem sophisticated. But underneath the fancy detachable collar, which is actually where the name comes from, they had zero grasp of rigorous Western science or rational thought. It perfectly captures that deep fear that Iranians were becoming hollow, superficial copies of Westerners. All surface, literally no substance. Eventually, though, this led to a huge revolutionary shift. Iranian thinkers realized they had to metabolize Western knowledge to reclaim their own authentic authorship and identity. There's this fantastic quote from the sociologist Ali Shariati that hits the nail right on the head. He said, "We must learn and know whatever they say, but we have to forget and think for ourselves." He was arguing that to truly break free, intellectuals needed to learn Western science, sure, but then they had to strip it of its imperial authority and adapt it independently to their own society. Basically, they had to stop mimicking and start creating. So what you should really take away from this explainer is this final provocative thought. It fundamentally challenges our very definition of what it means to be conquered. Yes, Iran's staggering geography and brilliant diplomatic balancing act kept it off the official list of formal colonies. But if a nation keeps its borders, yet loses control of its economy, its natural resources, and its intellectual independence, was it ever truly uncolonized? It is a huge question and one that completely redefines how we look at sovereignty in the modern world.